Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Let me officially welcome to this session on this accompanying event to the presentation of the EU climate adaptation strategy. This afternoon session is on climate adaptation modeling, state of the art, and a recommendation. So just 2 words to introduce this event. For those who are joining us today, let me just say that this is a 2 days event. Yesterday we had the opening, and this event is organized on behalf of DG Clima in collaboration with the Euro-Mediterranean Center of Climate Change as an accompanying event to the presentation of the new EU climate adaptation strategy. And the aim is to reflect a little bit with a high-level panel of experts on the content of the new strategy and on the challenges. In particular, this session today is meant to present the main result of a work that has been supported by DG Clima on adaptation modeling. And in a second, I'm introducing the panelists and the researcher and scientists that developed this work. And this responded to the need, the increasing need by the policy making environment to use, access better information for adaptation planning and design of adaptation strategies. So let me introduce the speakers that we are going to have today. And first of all, we have Rian Ibrey, Junior Researcher at the Institute for Environmental Studies at the Free University of Amsterdam, and joined by Marlene de Ruyter, which is Assistant Professor at the Department of Water and Climate Risk, still again at the Institute for Environmental Studies at the Free University of Amsterdam. We have with us Enrico Scoccimarro, Senior Scientist at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, working on the Climate Simulation and Prediction Division. That we have Kees van Ginkel, research at Deltares on climate change adaptation, coastal and riverine flood risk management, decision making under deep uncertainty. Ad Joken, expert advisor at Deltares on adaptation to climate change. Then we have Paola Mercogliano, director of the Regional Model and Geohydrological Impact Research Division at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. Antonio Trabucco, senior researcher at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. Impacts on Agriculture, Forestry and Ecosystem Service Division. This is basically part of the team that worked on this study on adaptation modeling supported by DG Clima. Who's speaking is Francesco Bosello. I'm one of the co-responsible and co-coordinator of the study itself. I'm senior scientist at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change and professor of economics at the University of Venice, Ca' Foscari. So before starting and with the presentation that will be structured following more or less the structure of the study itself. So I will open with a very quick overview of the overall project to then leave Rian the floor to present the result of the survey on adaptation modeling, and then we shall see other interesting chapters and sections of the work. Let me remind that after this session, that will be also will include a Q&A part at the end of the presentation. You are very welcome to attend also the high-level policy panel that will start at a 4:15 and should end at around 6 o'clock. You are very welcome to attend this panel with where we have really high level speakers and people in charge of adaptation strategy. Okay, so this said, let me start with a short overview of the study itself. So you should be able to see my screen. Okay. Okay. So perfect. So this session is aimed to present the study on adaptation modeling that is specifically meant to support policy. And of course, our main client is DG Clima. So it is policy support in general, but with a specific focus for those level of decision making where more strategic decisions are taken. And this work, of course, benefited from the expertise of high-level research panel of research institutions across the EU. So we have the CMCC, Deltares, the Institute for Environmental Studies from the Free University of Amsterdam, and Paul Watkins Associates. By the way, Paul Watkins will be also himself will be the moderator of the high panel event later this afternoon. The research objective of the study is to respond to this need by the policymaking environment to better understand what is out there to develop analysis of adaptation. Somehow mitigation policies and mitigation policy tools are quite well investigated, whereas there is a kind of lack of knowledge in adaptation modeling and adaptation modeling to support adaptation decision. So we have a specific objective to take a stock of what is there, so what is available, and to orient and guide policymaker in the choice of the tools that are produced and also the interpretation of the results from these tools, which are currently available, and also to present some recommendation either to advance knowledge in this domain in the next future, and also to provide indication on how some simple or rapid analysis for adaptation could be available and feasible and developed. And you shall see in what follows that we are going to touch upon each of these specific topics, with in particular at the end we shall have three very interesting presentations on these examples of rapid analysis. So we try to be, let's say, more interactive and also propositive, showing what can be three examples. In the study there are many more, where some rapid analysis, rapid access of information could be achieved. This is basically the research structure of our research activity, so the structure of the work. Let me say that we had a workshop already in September where we presented the main result of the study, which has been followed by a lot of attendees. So, but we are happy to see that the interest in this topic is still very very lively. The first part of our work consisted in a comprehensive desk review that will be introduced in a second by Rian, where we exactly take stock of what is out there. So we reviewed and we present methodologies, and we constructed a sort of database of easy consultation where we highlighted for the different methodologies, users, methods, inputs, output data, strengths and weaknesses, sustainability, suitability for rapid assessment, gaps, in order to organize or systematize this huge and rapidly increasing literature. Then we moved, starting from the existing knowledge, we build upon that to identify research gaps. So we identify what is missing, and we are also suggesting some conceptual guidelines to develop adaptation assessment. And finally, using and developing use cases and case studies, we try to be as concrete, as practical as possible to identify concrete actions to foster and enable the desired improvement that should be at hand in order to increase the uptake and the use of adaptation modeling by the policymaking community. One particular focus of the work has been to suggest and identify room for rapid analysis. And the issue of rapidity and easy accessibility of information is one of the most important needs that has been flagged by policymaking at the different levels, not just at the EU level, but also at the local level. So this is something that an aspect in our work that has received a particular attention. We are also, by the way, proposing some practical examples where we provided scripts for accessing the data and to run some types of models, those that are open source and that are more accessible by the majority of potentially interested users. So, and I'm closing now to leave the floor to the other speakers. What are the product of our work? So first of all, a full report. Part of it is already available on DigiClima website. So the extensive desk review is there. We shall produce in a short amount of time some non-expert, some brochure for non-experts. So usually where we are going to use hopefully a language that is accessible also to non-modelers. And we are producing a book for containing the proceedings of the September workshop and a scientific publication that should appear in more or less 6 months from now. These are again the research institutes that are still involved, because this process, we are in the phase of conclusive phase of the research. But now I just want to give the floor to Rian to present the outcome from the first, the heart also, I would say, the work, which is the extensive desk review on adaptation modeling. Let me stop the sharing and give the floor to Rian.
Great, thanks very much for that, Francesco. I'm Rian. I'm a junior researcher at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and I've been in charge of collating this comprehensive desk review for the study. So during the workshop yesterday, we've already had some really insightful presentations from a range of different experts in response to the latest climate adaptation strategy. And they've all been really positive on the progress that this new strategy has been presenting. But there has been a clear message that we need to be driving a new translation of academic research into action on adapting to climate change. So this afternoon, I'm going to be covering our newly published comprehensive desk review of climate adaptation models and tools as one of these potential tools to help bridge this gap. So the desk review supports the aims of the European Commission's aim to greater informed decision-making on climate adaptation at multiple governance levels. It provides a comprehensive, up-to-date and forward-looking overview of the range of technical, economic and non-monetary model and tool methods for climate risk, sectoral impacts and climate adaptation assessments. The review aims not only to collate current knowledge on different climate adaptation assessment methods, but to highlight research gaps in each of those fields. We provided as well a supporting annex, which provides greater detail on individual models and tools in the form of a kind of database, and those are discussed under the different methodological approaches within this review. So key stakeholders of the review have been identified as policy and public decision makers, investment, finance and insurance, the private sector, research and civil society and NGOs working at the European, national and local and project scales. So the desk review is designed to support policy making by using this European Environment Agency's Climate Adapt policy cycle as a framework, which is shown here. So the model and tool methods reviewed can support policy planning through providing information for these first 4 stages of the cycle, which are preparing the ground for adaptation, assessing risks and vulnerability to climate change, identifying and then assessing adaptation options. So based on this, we've got 4 key groups of models and tools that have been identified to support these 4 stages of the policy cycle. And these are climate risk assessments, sectoral impact and adaptation, economic assessments, and decision support systems. But because of the emphasis of the project was specifically on adaptation, if you read through the review, you'll notice that pure climate modeling, such as from global circulation or regional climate models, have actually been excluded from this review. As such, the desk review is structured using these model categories, and I'll briefly go over what's included within each of them. So the first chapter looks at hazard, exposure and vulnerability modelling, which can be used to support the identification of climate risks to be addressed within climate adaptation strategies. The identification of extreme climate events, changes in their spatial and temporal occurrence, and the compounding impact of multiple hazards are also paramount in identifying this risk. And so methods to identify these are also included in this chapter. The second chapter, which covers sectoral models for impact and adaptation assessments, typically use the outputs from the previous chapter. So this allows the models to assess the impact and response of important socioeconomic sectors to climate events. Incorporating adaptation strategies into those models can then be a test of potential effectiveness to support decision-making and justify investment. Economic modelling can be used to assess the efficiency of adaptation measures, and so both macroeconomic models along with behavioural economics and insurance are discussed in the third chapter. But if we need to involve multiple stakeholders in decision making, further analysis may be needed to provide an inclusive assessment. So the fourth chapter presents qualitative and semi-qualitative techniques to support consideration of the interests of these stakeholders. The fifth chapter discusses a range of decision support methods and tools. So these can be used to support stakeholders to decide how to use the information to generate optimal adaptation strategies under different criteria, uncertainties and situations. And the final chapter on future research conducts a gap analysis of the reviewed literature in the previous chapters. And I'll go over that in a little bit more detail shortly. So to show you a little bit more about what you can actually expect to get from the review, I'll go through one of the reports with you. So if I go to this is our desk review. So this is one of our reports. This is ecosystems and biodiversity sitting in within chapter 2 of the sectoral impact assessments. And they all follow a very similar structure. So we start off with a few brief sentences just to introduce the topic to you, and then introducing who the users are of this particular report and at what spatial scales we expect these to be relevant to. We then go through the different stages of the policy cycle that I've identified previously in the presentation, the climate adapt policy cycle, and then have a short brief introduction to the wider topic as a whole. We then move on to some layman explanations on the different groups of family methodologies. So we don't go into specific models here, but these are kind of just very brief overviews of different approaches within these modeling types. So for this example, we've looked at species distribution modeling, species diversity models, and species extinction risks and levels. And then we move on to have a look at kind of very briefly what might be those assumptions and how do you verify those models as well. And then we need to have a look at what kind of input data will you be needing in order to use these models, as well as what kind of outputs you can expect to receive from them, which is obviously important when we're trying to plan what models we want to choose and what can we expect when designing policy. We then move on to the strengths and weaknesses of the different model families. So these, as I say, again, aren't looking at specific models, but just these different approaches. And then we have a brief look at whether these would be suitable for a rapid analysis, and then finally looking at any research gaps within this particular field. So as I mentioned, this is a methodological approach of kind of groups of families of models. But if I take you to our annex now, so this is where we have our kind of more database of the individual models. You can see they're all in this kind of table format. So it starts off identifying which chapter it belongs to, which particular report. So this is chapter 2 of ecosystems biodiversity. And here's an example of the model vortex. So we first of all look at a brief introduction on the model itself, what kind of outputs can you expect from it? And this I should repeat is all in layman's terms, so it should be accessible to everyone. We then look at whether the model's open access or whether you require a license to use this model. What are the key input data, and is that data accessible and available to us? What are the strengths and limitations and the weaknesses of this model again? And what kind of spatial and temporal scale and resolution does this model operate at? We then look at, again, the accessibility of the output. So do we need specific technical knowledge and requirements to use and interpret this model? And how does this support our policy cycle, along with an example of how this might be used in order to develop policy? We then provide in this relevant application section a case study of how this model has been previously used, and then we look at and provide some of the main references for you, as well as whether it's suitable for rapid analysis or not. So I'll just go back to, I think this is my presentation. Great, okay. So now I'm just going to go through an example of how the desk review can be used from a stakeholder's perspective. So we've had a couple of people from city authorities yesterday discussing their particular challenges in adapting to climate change. So I used an example of a local government decision maker wanting to explore adaptation options to rising localized temperature from an urban heat island effect. So I'll just be clear that I'm not personally an expert in this field, but I'm just going to be using the literature reviewed as an example for you as to how you might be able to use the desk review in practice. So the potential natural starting point would be to use climate data and global circulation and regional climate models. And these normally feed into the climate risk assessments of chapter 1. But as I previously mentioned, these climate models haven't been included in the desk review. And in this instance, you know, these global circulation models, they don't provide high enough resolution outputs yet for looking at adaptation at the city scale. So for our example, an assessment of urban heat island effect could start with pure climate data and obtain temperature maps of our study area, for example. But we can see here from Shen et al. That urban areas have really highly complex environments and with strong temperature gradients. And so the weather stations may not be able to provide an accurate or high enough resolution temperature variation for us to actually work with. So modeling could be used in this example to get a more accurate spatial representation of temperature. So for instance here, Hoel have generated this temperature map using a random forest model to greater accurately map urban temperature than just purely using weather station data. We might also want to look at other complementary topics in the review, which are important influences on modelling urban heat island effect and testing any adaptation strategies. So this could include things such as heat waves, how to use indices to identify extreme temperature events, and potentially incorporating different emission scenarios as well. And of course, we might also want to have a look at what sort of socioeconomic vulnerability indicators we might use as well. Second, we might want to use a range of physical urban models and socioeconomics to be applied to test the impact of different adaptation policies and strategies. So while for this example of urban heat island effect, chapter 2.8 might be the most appropriate, but other relevant chapters for local government decision making could include those on critical infrastructure, buildings, transport, and heat and health. So this paper by Hout et al. Used varying socioeconomics and land use patterns to propose 6 different city development scenarios indicated across the top here. And based on these varying urban growth patterns, we can see here how different land use policies and development strategies can impact on the urban heat island effect. So based on these models, if we were to follow a not cure city pattern, so that's the bottom middle image here, then we can see that the urban heat island effect could be much more widespread than if we were to follow land use policies that promoted either a reactive or a green city scenario. And finally, we can conduct economic assessments and bring in decision support tools. So in the desk review, cost-benefit analyses can be found in the 5th chapter of how to use the information, but there is some overlap because obviously this can come under sort of economics and finances really. So here, Carter and Keel conducted a life cycle cost-benefit analysis to compare the net present values of green versus conventional roofs, incorporating both wider societal and individual benefits within that. So the authors found in this instance, for example, that the cost of green roofing needed to reduce by about 20% in order to make the net present value lower than that for a conventional roof. So I hope that's given you a bit of a brief overview of the desk review and how it can be used. So I'll move on to the last chapter and what are the current gaps in the research. So the gap analysis of the literature review identified 4 main categories. So those are gaps in data availability, accessibility, analysis and processing, addressing dynamics and feedbacks, model coupling, and within decision support. So gaps within the first category include issues around the resolution and completeness of data from climate models and scenarios, as the resolution of global circulation and regional climate models are 2 cores for local scale adaptation assessments. Similar issues of scalability are present within most hazard, exposure, and vulnerability data as well. Improving the accessibility of online systems are also needed, such as through upgrading current systems to enable the handling of large amounts of data and generating websites that are attractive for policymakers and enable rapid access for assessment tools. Finally, further research is also needed on the cost of adaptation and bridging the gap between modelled large-scale adaptation cost estimates, such as by integrated assessment models, and more precise local analyses. So within gaps addressing the dynamics and feedbacks, hazard and adaptation assessments should consider the effect of multiple hazards and greater model and quantify the impact of extreme events. However, current hazard impact models don't account for compound or consecutive multi-hazards, and there is little understanding at the moment regarding the impact of extreme events, such as on the impact of crop production. Greater development is needed in areas such as socio-hydrology and agent-based models, in which human and physical dynamics and feedbacks are co-examined together to determine their relative influence on each other. These interactions are currently largely missing from hazard, vulnerability, and adaptation models. There also needs to be more work regarding the development of models that assess the wider indirect economic impacts of climate change and adaptation. Thirdly, there are challenges when coupling these models. Ideally, model-based analysis should have adaptation frameworks that are conducted integrating the whole causal chain, from climate stresses to adaptive responses, into one unifying modelling framework. But currently, hard-linked integrated assessment models are 2 cores for assessing the implementation of adaptation measures. Linkages, synergies, combinations, and coherence of climate change adaptation and mitigation solutions at all levels and sectors should be further pursued. This especially needs to be achieved to climate-proof sectors that are key to greenhouse gas emission reductions, such as land use, agriculture, energy, and transport. The final category discusses gaps in decision support. Challenges include management of uncertainty, the length of time and resources required, which may conflict as well with the needs of decision makers, and the inaccessibility of decision support systems to non-experts. So overall, the desk review covers quite a wide range of topics within the process of developing adaptation strategies, aiming to provide a bridge in understanding between the technicalities of adaptation modeling and decision making. So it's hoped that the desk review will represent a guide to a range of different users and help progress information accessibility beyond academia. Yet the gap analysis does highlight key future research areas and needed for development of policymaking based on adaptation modeling. Not only could the review promote understanding of what is currently possible, but guide our future efforts to develop our knowledge further. So hopefully, if you think that this review would be of use to you and your organization, you can actually now find the reports that have been published on the European Union's official website using these links. Many thanks for your time and attention.
Thank you, Rian. Very nice presentation, very comprehensive, and also I appreciate the effort to condense 1,000 pages in in 20 minutes presentation. There's really a huge document. Let me just say to our audience, because we already received a lot of questions where we can find the material. Rian, you already showed that the material is being published by, made available by the Commission on the official website. I pinpoint the interested attendees to also the CMCC website, where all the presentation from the September workshop that some partly overlaps with this could be found, because the presentation that you are seeing now will be very likely made publicly available, but we need to first check with the DG Clima, because this event is organized on their behalf. So we need to have a minimum of green light to share the material, but of course there will be soon available also on at the CMCC website. But this will happen in a week from now, so they're not now immediately available. Rian, I see that also other attendees congratulate for the very nice presentation. Okay. So I would also now, move to the next speaker. He's Enrico Scoccimarro. Enrico is going to present some focus on a recommendation that starting from the gap analysis that has been briefly introduced by Rian, some practical recommendation that the research team think to provide to foster and direct research activity in the next future. So Enrico, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good afternoon to everybody. This is Enrico Scoccimarro from CNCC. Sorry, but I prefer to switch off the camera since I'm having few problems with the bandwidth these days. So we are just here to briefly summarize part of the work that we have done within the study on adaptation modeling for policy support, the one introduced by Francesco at the beginning of the session. And in particular, I will list step by step the main outcome of the gap analysis. I will just mention it, trying to add something to what has been already described in the previous talk, and also we will take a look at the recommended approach tasks that we had in our activity. Okay, so the idea behind this study is to propose recommended approaches to analysis and modeling for a better informed decision making and adaptation at various levels of governance. It also identifies research advancement to foster the development and application of the technical, economic, and non-monetary analysis and modeling of climate change, hazard, and adaptation. More specifically, building on the comprehensive desk review, we aim to summarize and outline a recommended approach for each of the main cases, analysis, and modeling. We also define and outline relevant follow-up for the coming 5 years period with a view to improving the approach for each of the main cases. As already said, a useful conceptual framework for the development of adaptation analysis can be derived by the adaptation policy cycle. And this is schematized in the adaptation support tool, the AST by the Climate Adapt. And although referring to the policy action, the 6 AST steps offer a useful identification of the main phases of the whole adaptation process. And this can be easily translated into investigation phases. The gaps have been grouped in 4 main categories, as already said: gaps in data availability, accessibility, analysis and processing, gap in addressing dynamic and feedbacks, model coupling, and decision support. Regarding the first group of data availability, analysis and processing, the spatial and temporal resolution of GCM has increased, and also the downscaling through RCM has been increasing in the past years up to 10-30 kilometers, but this is still generally too coarse to useful support several adaptation assessments. This issue is addressed by applied downscaling techniques and bias correction, but the uncertainty remains large in all of these methods. Also, online services to analyze climate data have become increasingly popular in research over the last 5 years. We can mention the Kinema one, the Climate Explorer, among others, but the current system needs to be upgraded to enable the handling of large amount of data. And this is still not that friendly for the users. And also, future application of services should constantly expand the number of variables, climate fields considered. Then, despite the enormous growth in the other data from, for example, remote sensing, the data quality and time series length is not always sufficient. This is, for instance, the case of the hydrological model that require large enough data set for calibrate and validate the result, and also the implementation and quantification of the role of the climate change adaptation in different scenarios building exercise is still less developed and consolidated than the one of climate change mitigation. These are all areas of research that deserve more effort and that we must consider in our socioeconomic modeling community. Moving to the next group of gaps, first of all, model-based analysis on adaptation should be conducted integrating the whole causal chain from the climate stressor to adaptive response into one unifying modeling framework, and this is indeed the final aspiration goal. However, the resolution is still too coarse in the whole model, and an alternative is to try to couple the different models dealing with the specific dimension of the chain with the desired level of detail. So we could decide to put more effort in increasing the resolution of some components and paying attention to the right coupling between this component and the other one. An example where couple models are required is the energy sector, particularly for the new technologies such as the wave and tidal power, but also the solar power. The last gap group is the one on the decision support, and policy action on adaptation is not yet supported by fully transparent information on different uncertainty sources, and the majority of the DSS or DST or whatever does not evolve beyond the pilot and demonstration phases, and this is hardly replicable outside the original context. So if we now move to the recommendation to bridge the aforementioned gap, next term, let's say 5 years action that can further facilitate the application of climate impact economic modeling from practical usable adaptation analysis follow the 3 main lines that you see here: improving climate information for adaptation, improving information on adaptation cost and effectiveness, and finally improving tools for decision making under uncertainty. Regarding the first line, the suggestion is to increase the availability, reliability, and accessibility of climate information with the right spatial resolution, and improve and extend downscaling methodologies. And the operational step to do this might be first a systematic evaluation of the domain of applicability of the statistical downscaling, then a systematic comparison between dynamical and statistical downscaling performance in representing the statistic of the different climate parameters. Then the support to the development of higher horizontal resolution general circulation model, participating, for instance, the one participation to the Copernicus climate change services that are also partially the ones that in other dimension take part to the couple model intercomparison project and so on and so forth. This will be, could be really helpful to increase the horizontal resolution of such models, but also to facilitate the addition of new members to the actual C3S systems. Regarding the second line on improving the information on adaptation cost and effectiveness, focus on a systematic comparison of results across the region in terms of adaptation studies is needed, and operationally, we need to promote a systematic survey of the existing quantitative evidence on adaptation cost to highlight ranges for adaptation cost at different scales and to project adaptation cost trends under different climate change scenarios. Regarding the last line on the improvement of decision-making under uncertainty, we need to promote methods that assess robust performance across multiple scenarios and direct the decision makers toward more flexible solutions. This can be somehow, again, operationally achieved. First, developing protocols for climate data use for different decision contexts. And also, if the adaptation action has to be defined before the middle of the century, multimodal use should be prioritized over the multi-scenario use. And finally, not only ranges of climate variability and change must be considered, but also the level of exposure, sensitivity, effectiveness, and cost. I stop here, and as already said, a deep description of this gap analysis and recommended approach can be found in the reports that we provided to DG Clima, and we really hope that this will be of support for a better informed decision making on adaptation at different level of governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrico, also for this interesting point of view on recommended approach, focusing and based on the gap analysis that we developed. As anticipated, the part of our work is based not just on the survey of the literature, but on the concrete examination of case studies and use cases. And let me also add the point that this analysis has been also supported by an extended set of interviews that we conducted with the experts and practitioners in the field of adaptation. So we also, I mean, this is an open study where we received a lot of input from the outside. So I will leave the floor now to present insights that we have gotten from our use cases. So Ad, the floor is yours.
So I'll be presenting the results on the use cases and the case studies for rapid analysis. But this is a joint effort of many people and the many institutes involved in this study, as Francesco introduced already at the start. So yeah, what is the motivation for adaptation modeling and rapid analysis in particular? Is that we are now in a phase of within the EU that we and also the EU adaptation strategy is confirming this, that we really should move to action on adaptation. And so there is an increasing need for mainstreaming adaptation in among many different users and sectors. Urgencies are different between those users and sectors, but they're all pointing in the same direction of increase to do so. And these urgencies also have differ because of some sectors are more aware, some sectors than others, and some sectors are still more in the planning phase, and others are more ready for actions. And of course, this adaptation plays a role at different scales and resolutions. So the question is how can adaptation modeling, with this increasing need for mainstreaming adaptation in decision making, how can this be improved? And then in particular for this presentation, to make it easier and faster accessible. So in other words, how to improve rapid analysis. So what we have been trying to do is to come up with some recommendations to DG Klima, how to improve this situation. So what have we been doing? So we're building basically on the work that Rian has been presenting. So this very extensive disk review with also a particular section on suitability of tools for rapid analysis. And this view has been complemented by interviews with representatives of different users and sectors. And we also have analyzed a large number of case studies, of which 24 have been published in the report in the end, and that they all give examples of application of rapid analysis tools in a particular decision-making context. So what we have done is to map basically what are the decision-making problems and what are the objectives for adaptation modeling within these decision-making contexts, and in particular for rapid analysis. And then we also have looked at the current state of the art of modeling, what are the options to achieve rapid analysis objectives in these particular contexts. And from there we have tried to suggest a kind of a pilot approach for rapid analysis in the future. And we have done this for 9 user cases. And these user cases, we will focus on public available data and models, and also a good coverage of the steps of the policy cycles, different types of hazards and other emerging issues. So what are the use cases? So these are the 9 use cases. You see 7 boxes. This is because some use cases have both a rapid analysis component as a more extensive modeling component. And you see the different levels they play at, and you see also the current need for rapid analysis in these use cases. And also on the vertical axis, you see to what extent adaptation is already a core business of these user groups. So as you can see on the top left end, there is the national adaptation planning and the DG Klima policy work on adaptation, which of course has adaptation as a core business. But often these are also very elaborate policy processes that only can marginally be supported by rapid analysis. So the need for rapid analysis in these cases is at the moment not very high. Another example in this corner is flood insurance, another use case that we looked at, where of course hazards are at the core of this sector. And this is also a very elaborate process with a lot of data and not a particular need for rapid analysis. More in the center of this picture, you see the use cases of urban adaptation and regional adaptation planning. And that's basically typical planning processes where adaptation is an important aspect of the planning, but it has to be, the objectives of adaptation have to be matched with many other objectives, planning objectives. And we see that there is a increasing need for rapid analysis in these cases, as there's also an increasing involvement of stakeholders in the planning process, and often this involvement is supported by interactive modeling tools that, and of course, to be interactive and communicate should be rapid in some way. More on the right end, we see there's more the financial sector and investment, EU investment projects, for instance, the investments that are supported by the European Investment Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. There you see there is a increasing regulation also on including resilience, climate resilience into the processes. But it's only a smaller aspect of the decision making still. But the processes are also very restricted in time, and also part of formal procedures that also restrict the use of modeling in adaptation modeling in these processes. So also there is a need for, a great need for rapid tools that can be well incorporated into these strict processes. In addition to the current situation, I also draw some arrows to show that indeed the urgency and the need for this rapid analysis is increasing, and also that because of the mainstreaming, adaptation is also becoming more and more core businesses of all use cases that we considered. So then some conclusions on the objectives for rapid analysis that we teased out of this study. And first of what are the main roles that we can see rapid analysis play within the decision-making processes. And we see that it's very well suited to identify hotspots, spatial hotspots, and also priorities for adaptation when you, based on rapid analysis of hazards, risks, etc. It can also, and also referring to my last remarks on the business and private sector cases, it can also be helpful to streamline the appraisal process of investment plans and projects where climate resilience needs to be incorporated. And it can also help, especially when it's supported by the portals as like from Copernicus and others, can also help to support quality assured and transparent risk screening of larger portfolios of assets. If we look also how can rapid analysis be not only the technical side of rapid analysis can be improved, but also how can it gain more relevance? And we think that this is can be, and that's not only important for rapid analysis, I think for adaptation modeling in general, it can gain more relevance when it's more decision-led also. So by that I mean that really rapid analysis should start not from looking at the GCMs, but looking at what are the sector-specific decision metrics, and how can it also not only support risks, but screening of risk, but also identify and maybe to some extent also do a rapid evaluation of different adaptation options on costs and benefits. And how can it also be used to do this more collaboratively, and also include some elements of decision making on uncertainty, as was indicated by Enrico in previous presentation, is a gap in current adaptation modeling. So to give an example, in this picture at the bottom, so the main decision making problem, for instance, for the urban planning environment is to develop the urban environment in a resilient way, and and incorporate adaptation to climate change into this process. So there's a participatory planning process that should be supported by tools and services that are based on well, these open and transparent databases of climate and hazard and vulnerability information. So the rapid analysis can also be improved, and when we really understand also the restrictions and the constraints of the decision-making process better. Each sector, each user group has its particular decision-making process, so it's really important to understand this and tailor also the tools to these processes. And again, also not only in the application, but also maybe in the development of the rapid analysis tools, it's very important to include also these different users. And I think also by applying rapid analysis, the range can also be extended of these applications by improving transparency, accessibility, and quality. And this can be done by further increasing availability of open source data, not only at the EU level, but also at the national level. And not only look at these GCMs and the climate projection, but especially also at hazard information, exposure information, but also vulnerability information. So also pay a lot of attention to loss and damage records in the past and for different decision contexts. Also to allow the tools that use these data also to include more local vulnerability data, because that's always a problem of it's not only the resolution at the local level that's maybe lacking, but also the inclusion of the relevant local vulnerability data. And please also use and also the new technological advances in these tools, like new data products from the geo community, but also new analysis methods that, for instance, use artificial intelligence. So almost my last slide. So how could a pilot approach for rapid analysis then look like? And again, also in this report on the rapid analysis, we follow the adaptation support tool steps on adaptation planning, and look at the applicability to step 1 to 4. So preparing it for planning, assessing risk and vulnerability, identifying the options, and assessing adaptation options. And I think rapid analysis tools can be improved if they can be based on quality checked, accessible open source data platforms on these 3 levels that are shown here in this picture. So the EU level, but also national data and service platforms are also emerging and can be improved, and maybe even on a regional level. It's also depending on how different countries have organized the responsibility for adaptation and to climate change. And have tools that really connect these data platforms, so it's really these decision-led processes that are happening at the user level, and that allow for inclusion of these of local data, especially on vulnerability, but also exposure data are sometimes better at the local level than at a global level, and also include local knowledge on adaptation options that are feasible and within this local context. So this would be the recommended approach, or this pilot approach for rapid analysis. And this can, of course, have different shapes in these different user contexts. And I think the 3 next presentations will give some more examples of how this could be looking like in practice. I think also, given the time, I have to conclude here. If the presentations are being made available, also the reports are available. There's also a whole list of research and innovation actions that could be taken into the coming 5 years to achieve this recommended approach. And so it's on co-production research. It's also on making repositories of adaptation options available. For instance, build also and maintain libraries on attributions of impacts of climate change. So different recommendations. I'm not going to mention them all. And there's also some coordination action that could also support this joint development of these next generation rapid analysis tools with the different user communities, and also capacitate these communities in using the tools. So I thank you for your attention, and well, also in the presentation here I included the links to both the reports that are on the use cases and the example 24 cases of rapid analysis. So thank you. Over to you, Francesco.
Thank you, Ad, very much. And now we are going to enter the more applied part of the session, where we have 3 examples of rapid access or relatively rapid access to information. But before doing that, so I would like to take just 10 minutes, not more, to address some questions that have been raised during this presentation, also to break a little bit the rhythm and having some more interaction with our audience. And so I just pinpointed 2 questions that I addressed to the to the presenter. One question is focusing on the role of cities and how these, given that cities are increasingly a hotspot for risk, because we have seen this for climate change, but also for COVID. So how these could, I'm trying to translate the question in terms of the work that we did. What are the implications of this increasing role of cities for the adaptation challenge, and what we found in our work in this respect? The other, we had a lot of questions on the relation between climate change risk, adaptation, vulnerability, and also COVID-19. So how these 2 things could be put together. So this is a huge I mean, it's a very ample question that requires also an ample and wide reply. On this, my very personal point of view is that basically climate change should be, and increasing the resilience against climate change should be also a way to increase the resilience against any other kind of risk that we could be, we as society could be facing. So, and very often, a lot of measures that decrease the vulnerability against climate change risk also decrease the vulnerability against other kinds of stressors, like for instance pandemic, like in this case something which is related to respiratory disorders. So we know that there are these links. So building resilience means and improving our adaptive capacity towards climate change improves also adaptive capacity towards a whole set of different stressors, and enable us to develop methodologies that could be also applied to improve our adaptive capacity beyond the domain of climate change itself. Also considering the fact that the climate challenge is something that goes beyond the environmental dimension to tackle more the sustainability dimension of our development. But I just want to direct to our speakers the question of cities, because this is something that emerged also often in our survey work, and in the need also of information by local authorities and cities. So could you please share your thoughts with the audience on this? Perhaps, if I may, I would like to perhaps to hear a very technical comment by Paola, because she worked a lot on the urban dimension, but also add. So we have expertise here to say something about that. So please.
So ladies first, I would say then. Paolo?
Paola, you're muted. Okay, perfect.
Okay. I would say that there is a large opportunity now for adaptation in urban areas. For example, in Copernicus, as mentioned before, we are working now to provide a catalog of extreme events over Europe, and with detailed analysis over 20 cities. Of course, the problem of the urban areas is that we need to have more detailed tool to assess the impact, because in the urban areas we have also phenomena like the urban heat island and the effect of a built environment. And then we need to improve our capability in terms of a climate model to represent correctly the climate change. This is the goal. But about adaptation, I think that in parallel way, we are moving on, because there are many tools that can be used to support the urban planning. For example, we have a software running at 2 meters of resolution, able to evaluate the efficiency of the different adaptation actions that can be implemented at urban area. Then I'm positive about the next year, but of course there is a lot to do, because my last thinking is about the development of this new regional climate model at 2 kilometers, and this of course can be a real benefit for to quantify the impact of climate change, and then to address the problem of the adaptation at the urban level.
Thank you, Paola. Ad, you want to add something?
Well, just very briefly, I think I already showed one slide on the urban resilience development. That's the main aim of cities, and indeed, and many other objectives are part of this, including COVID, which is for me yet difficult to see how this can be part of a particular analysis. But in general, the analysis of in urban environments is also on how to design the public space in cities to accommodate for heat, floods, but also at the same time take into account changing transportation systems that answer also to mitigation objectives. So there's really a lot of things coming together. So this means for tools also that I should really show this spatial dimension, not only on the hazards, but also on the city layout, the exposure of the different spatial functions in the urban landscape. This will be my brief response.
Exactly. Anyway, it is clear that the adaptation challenge is largely also an urban challenge, because we're huge exposure there, a lot of assets, a lot of people, Anyway, eventually the climate change challenge will be solved also at the urban level, also considering the amount of emissions that cities are producing. So this is definitely the area where we have to work. Of course, one of the main areas. I also encourage our speakers, if not while they are presenting, of course, but perhaps they could also answer directly to the questions posed through the Q&R facility, because they could address the question, writing direct the reply to those who are raising the question directly. We have other questions that I would leave for the end, but for the sake of time, I would like to move to the second part of our session. There is not really a first and a second part, but let's say the more operational one, presenting some concrete examples or demonstration on how accessible these data and these methodologies are. So I would like to start with Kees van Ginkel from Deltares. So Kees, the floor is yours to present your case study. I can see you. So that's when you are ready, you can go.
Thank you very much, Francisco. So I will go into a very practical tool with a very simple stylized example on using the adaptive pathway generator. And I already heard a lot of talking in this workshop on decision making under deep uncertainty. And there is many tools actually being developed to do this. And this is one of the simplest and straightforward ones to do something with policies that change over time and that are working in many possible scenarios. And that brings me to the reason why you should actually want to use or develop dynamic adaptive policy pathways. I took this image from Twitter, and you can see actually how projections of 21st century sea level rise have changed. And it's very impressive to see how much those projections vary, and it shows that the magnitude and rate of climate change is very, very uncertain. And this is a problem for policymakers because you don't want to change or redo the very thorough policy analysis each time that a new climate scenario is published. So the objective of the tool is to present policy pathways that are independent of the climate scenario. And indeed, it is a rapid assessment tool that was proven during the September workshop, where participants, maybe also some of you, actually were able to learn and apply the tool within 30 minutes. So you can follow the link here. Maybe someone can copy it to the chat. And yeah, it's very easy to follow along with the practical example I will be presenting here. So let's first go into some terminology on adaptive pathways. We typically use this kind of metro map visualization. So on the x-axis, you see the changing conditions. So this is not expressed in time, but for example, in sea level rise. So it's the amount of sea level rise that may happen. The colors represent different actions. So those are the things, the possible system interventions that you can do to deal with this degree of sea level rise. And each action has a certain best before date. We call it an adaptation tipping point, meaning that at a certain degree of sea level rise, this action does no longer work. Well, at this point, you might want to transfer to another train line, basically. Those are indicated by the circles, showing that you can transfer from one action to another to meet your policy objective over time. So where do the scenarios come in? Well, you can actually also see them on the x-axis, where you can see how time is different in a low-end scenario and in a high-end scenario. So, for example, in a high-end scenario, 1 meter sea level rise might be within 80 years or 60 years, whereas in a low-end scenario, it takes much longer, and you can just add them to the x-axis. So to illustrate this, let me introduce you to this small island with a village, and the people living on this island have a problem because they see every year that their shoreline is getting shorter and shorter, and their objective is to mitigate to this. So they want to be safe and have a safe living, and don't be threatened by storm surges. So they sit together in a meeting and say, well, we have a horizon. Let's say we want to be safe until 2100 at least for now. And they make their targets and indicators a bit more practical. So they say, well, during a high tide, in a calm conditions, we should at least have a 100-meter beach, and we can accept that 10 houses per year flood, but no more. This is our limit. Well, they heard about these scenarios, so they put them in here. They took them from some report or something. And then they discuss the different adaptations actions they can take. So they think, well, maybe we can build a seawall that would protect against 75 centimeters. You could also replenish the beach with new sand every year. And another thing we could do is maybe moving our houses a bit back on the island by implementing setback lines. So in the adaptive pathway tool, you would first insert these actions on your screen. So here you can see the different actions with the adaptation tipping points. So basically the terminals of each action expressed in amounts of sea level rise. And the second thing is that you can now start discussing what different pathways through these actions you can take. So what we could do is first construct a seawall, but then, well, maybe at the sea level rise is more than 75 centimeters, then we should switch to another action. Well, of course, we can break down the seawall and then do beach replenishment, or maybe we can combine both actions, or first keep the village in the current location, and only when the seawall fails, we move our houses to higher grounds. There's different routes you can take through the different actions here. Those we call pathways. The next step is to add the scenarios to this visualization. Here you can see them appearing on the x-axis. So you can see that in the low sea level rise scenario, actually you will only have 50 centimeters of sea level rise. So it does not really matter which pathway we take. Any measure is good enough. If we also account for high and sea level rise scenarios, there's actually only one pathway that really will help us to the end of the century. So, so far, the village inhabitants sort of made this map and mapped what can be possibly done. And now they start debating on what should be the best thing to do. So, of course, taking each pathway has certain costs and benefits and co-benefits. Think of impacts to nature or recreational value. And they make a sort of scorecard to decide what they eventually will do. Now, the question is, of course, is it really rapid? Because if you listen carefully, you might have thought, well, where do they get all these data from? How do they know how far you can build a seawall? So basically, in Deltares, we use two approaches to work with adaptive pathway tools. So on the one hand, we use more like workshops or hackathon sessions, like I showed you in the village. So then you bring in a lot of experts which already have knowledge on this topic, and you ask them to brainstorm on the positions of the tipping points, the possible pathways, and which situation they prefer. And if you want to gain an impression on that, how that would look like, and also to be remembered about how fun it is to have real-life meetings, especially with young, energetic students, have a look in the YouTube channel at the videos on the hackathons. But of course, the second thing is also that you can use an in-depth consultancy or research project and use the adaptation pathways tool as a visualization, as a means of visualization. And actually, this has been done already by many governments. So it started off in the Netherlands, but also used to redesign a plan for the Thames estuary. It's applied in New Zealand, New York, but also beyond water management. I looked into the papers that cite the concept, and there's almost 1,000 academic applications of the method now in forestry, drought management, urban planning, groundwater, transport. So you can have a look at that and get some inspiration on what you can do. So to conclude, you can see how much different nice visualizations you can make. And if you now think, well, I can no longer see the forest from the wood, let us know, because we are very glad to help you with getting started with the tool. And as I said, it's super rapid and super easy to use. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith. Really very interesting. And we have just one question. No, we had already one question for you that you already replied partly. So is it possible that we consider also joint pathways? So, some adaptation action could be implemented together. So it's not necessarily the case that there are always alternatives.
Yeah, exactly. That is a very important point. So here you can see actually the difference. If we would only build the seawall, we could then demolish the seawall and go to beach replenishment, which is maybe a bit stupid to do, of course. But you could also combine both actions in a pathway. So then you would first build the seawall, and when that does no longer protect, you could, on top of that, replenish the beach. And you can see that the combined action of red and blue is a bit longer than either the blue one or the red one. So that is possible.
Thank you, Keith. Let me, for the sake of time, also give the floor to Paola Mercogliano. She will lead us in a totally different world, but as interesting. So Paola, the floor is yours. Unmute your microphone and we are listening.
Yes. Okay. I also shared in the chat the link to the Copernicus page if you want try doing my presentation to work with the service. Okay. First of all, okay, I would like to speak in this 10 minutes about a service available on Copernicus that could be very useful for the creation of the heat stress maps that could be very useful to assess the expected heat stress distribution over different IPCC scenarios. Of course, these have to support policymakers and to be informed about the local expected temperature trends. There are, as Enrico already explained before, there are different models that can be used as input to derive these heat stress maps. There are data coming from the global climate model and from the regional climate model in Europe now are available in the framework of the EUCAS program regional climate model at about 12 kilometers. In this product, the service that I'm going to show this afternoon, the data used as input are the one from the Cordex program at about 12 kilometers of resolution. Sometimes this kind of data are more largely used because the resolution of the climate model is very similar to the impact scale, and then you don't need to perform additional interpolation and so on. But as I also explained before, there are now the climate community is now trying to derive new climate model, also having a higher resolution. Okay, there are different services, as Francesco already mentioned, on Copernicus. But this afternoon, I would like to to show one that could be very useful to have an idea of which are the area more exposed to the heat wave events. Not only we have the assessment and then the status of the more exposed area in the control period, but also we have the climate projection considering two different IPCC scenarios, the RCP 4.5 and the RCP 8.5. If you are interested to give an overview, you can. I post the link on the chat. Okay. Specifically, which is the data that you can visualize and then download in this product. You can have the climate projection of the number of heat days for European countries. As explained before, on historical period and two different periods in the future. Why is it possible to have the absolute value of the heat these heat days in the future? Because they apply to the temperature and humidity. For the temperature, the bias correction. Bias correction applied to the output of the climate model can permit to have the absolute value of the heat days map of the absolute value of the heat days. And this data, for this reason, can be very useful for adaptation. If you don't apply bias correction, you only can consider the anomaly that perhaps, I mean, usually are less usable for adaptation analysis. There are the opportunity to visualize because heat wave, of course, can be defined in a very different way. In this application, you can have you can select among three different definitions of heat wave. The first one comes from the EUCAS program, and then is more related to the climate community. And then the heat wave is defined as a period of at least 3 consecutive days on which the daily maximum temperature exceeds the 99th percentile of the daily maximum temperature in the period May to September over the control period. We have also a second definition coming from the Hero Heat project. The Hero Heat project is a project more related to the impact to the health system, and it was coordinated by the WHO Europe, and then perhaps this can be more useful if you are interested in evaluation of the discomfort in the heat stress. While we have also a third opportunity, the one to use the national definition based on the national performed at national level, also correlating climate data and health observation. I mean, you can select or you can make comparison. About this third opportunity, I want also mention that this product you can have heat map and heat data at NATS1 level, mainly the country, but there are also specific country where you can have also an additional detail. For example, for Belgium and Italy, you can have data at NATS1 and NATS2 level, and for Hungary and Lithuania, you have NATS2 and NATS3 level. Then you can have a very detailed analysis. Okay, here, if you go on page, there are different windows, and if you go in the input of the window of the input data, you can have more detail about this application. First of all, in this application, you can find not only the heat wave, but also the cold wave. Okay, we decided today to focus on the heat wave. And here there are the features of the input data coming, as I told before, by the EUCAS program. The resolution of the climate data is about 12 kilometers, and you can download in the net CDF4 format. This is a binary format, and then this can be managed by MATLAB, R, and many other large used tool, but perhaps you need to have you need to be friendly with this kind of format because it's a little bit complex. Okay, okay, I don't want to spend my time to describe in detail the preprocessing analysis, but it's important to say that, as I told before, the temperature is bias corrected, and this is the reason for which you can have the absolute value and not the anomaly. Otherwise, this is not allowed. While for humidity is not performed bias correction. Okay, this is the different 6 steps for obtaining and to visualize the data. And here there is another window about the output of the data. And here you can select the period to visualize the map. We have 2 different periods, 2 different IPCC scenarios, and then the historical period. If you want to assess the status of the heat distribution during the control period, in order to evaluate also the evolution of this of the heat stress. Okay, this is an example of the map that you can visualize, and this is, for example, the near future period with the RCP, I don't see RCP 8.5, and you have the maps. You can have this hotspot, for example, over Italy and over Spain. You can easily see, but of course you can also decide to download the data and then to change the palette color if you don't like. Okay, and this is of course the far future, and you can see how will increase the number of the heat wave. Okay, and then finally, could be an application that very useful to perform the rapid assessment for the potential change of the heat wave event duration under different concentration scenarios. You can have, of course, this. I think that in the next year will be also possible to have data that can be useful for urban areas, because as told before, it's important in additional details. Also, if there are many other products working on this, for example, there is a product by Vito concerning the heat wave of urban areas. But this is a first opportunity to work on to have data about heat wave over Europe. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you, Paola. So I take advantage of my position of moderator to pose a question that could be of interest to the audience before leaving the floor to the last presenter, but not least. Paola, so in your opinion, what is the major obstacle for a rapid access to this data? So perhaps there is a bottleneck in the sense that an interested user should be able to know a little bit of R, let's say, for the scripts, and then perhaps there is also a constraint on the ability of storing this huge amount of data, or not? What do you think? So to improve the accessibility from a wider public perspective.
Okay, I think that Copernicus is working on this. If you select the storage can be a problem. My personal opinion is the better is to select a smaller area, and then to be able to work not at the NATS 1 level or European level, and then it can be useful to work on perhaps to download before one small area, and then to work with a small area. But also I won't say that there are many tools over internet that can be able to work with the NetCDF, because NetCDF can be easily managed by MATLAB, R, and so on. Unfortunately, the NetCDF for us is a strong requirement, because there are a lot of metadata that you need to also to download together with the data. And this is important in order to be sure about what you are downloading. But I think that if you good, if you make a good selection of the area, of the period, I think that for policymaker this could be very useful. But also the maps can be useful for a first assessment to have an idea of this hotspot.
So paradoxically, a local planner is advantage because he's interested in a small area, so he could take advantage of this information more easily. So
I think that it can be useful to work in serial way.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Paola. And as we were saying, we have now Antonio Trabucco, who is presenting the last example of, let's say, rapidity and accessibility of analysis. And again, I guess we are moving to the forestry sector somehow, or the fire. So, Antonio, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Francesco. Thanks for the screen. Hello, everybody. I'm going to discuss some implementation of a case study for rapid analysis for forest fire vulnerabilities, for a case study for forest vulnerability. Presenting this on behalf of my colleagues, of CMCC colleagues at the IAFES division in Sassari, which have been working for a long time on these topics. Let me see if I can move. Yes, please. So let me just briefly introduce that wildfires are a particular problem with a particular issue in terms of hazard, especially in Mediterranean areas. And every year there are about more than 400,000 hectares which are run by fire. So that really brings in important risk especially in the last decades, on socioeconomics, infrastructures, but also on functioning ecosystem services. And this has been worse and more even by the effects of climate extremes, which have become more evident due to last climate change. So there is really like a huge hazard here to discuss for especially for Mediterranean areas, and to face with this risk on fire management, it's using a huge asset of financial resources, about 2.5 billion euro every year. And this is just simply doing this for detection or extinction. So it's just like an extreme approach from emergent intervention, not very adapting to, but just trying to offset the damage somehow. But it's important now to, it is being important for many years, but it's even now the more important. The new paradigm is required to really divert all these expenses, the financial expenses, to a new shift where we can take into a more proactive and preventive field management through management of resources, so more optimal management resources to control fire, to control fuel code in forest and other ecosystems. So it's important in that sense that management needs to be very effective, and it needs to have information, indications of areas where optimize investments, prioritize investment, and to determine where those areas, how could they be affected, how intense can be the fire, weather events in the future. And this is all very dynamic. And also for the future, also for plan. So for planning into far future. So it's very important. It's a very important case for rapid analysis. So for controlling several aspects like assessment, prevention, preparedness, like move that into like management for controlling fire. So the need is really to express some information on fire danger very explicitly, very rapidly, and this is often done through, like, is an indicator which has been proposed for many years, and now it's becoming like common trend in use for fire control. Is the fire weather index, and the fire weather index elaborate information into and try to characterize different aspects of fire behavior. So you can really having these different aspects taken in consideration to articulate the management option. It's usually it's a numerical rating, so these are indicators along a scale, which just usually in general, as they are, refer to a standard reference of ecosystem. But what's really important is they are, aside from this, they are based on weather variables, climate variables, which are usually very much articulated and made available through operational services. So now, so they are available continuously at a very great speed with increasing accuracy, especially in the short-term forecast. And these are common, like refer to this temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, and precipitation. And these are elaborated into this indicator, which just defines fuel moisture conditions and to derive, in fact, what could be the behavioral indices. There are here, like this is here, you can see what could be this. There are 6 values in this fire weather index structure. The first 3 characterize the moisture code of different components of the ecosystem. So based on this different characterization, you can characterize better other indicators or much specific for fire behavior, like initial spread index, build-up index, and altogether fire weather index. So you know that this could be managerial, integrated into management system. It's important to say that this is very widespread, can be very articulated for different regions based on knowledge of the meaning of context-specific value and threshold for the regions. And since 2015 has been integrated in the EFIS service of the Copernicus Emergency Management System. As I mentioned, if you integrate this into like regional context, the numerical value itself can be specifically related to some example of actions. So now what's happening really, for instance, is an example for the Sardinia region. You can have these indicators, this like use case, translated into like some bulletin where it can inform forest management and other services on what could be the condition and explicitly what could be like the management option and that needs to be taken under an operational point of view. Of course, like as this move into like short to more like near term up to short term forecast into like far in the future, you can have actions that could be like more aiming at more articulated management of forest through like adaptation, and can be like extremely interesting because as you see, these bulletins are becoming like common standards. So usually like managers are very acquainted to these services. So they're realizing to know what is indicator value, they can be produced quite rapidly and they can have exact meaning for management. The tool itself, like we presented for the project here, was articulated, and it is articulated in the material that was already, the links were shared before, through like different steps where we really show like how the climate data, specific climate data which is needed, is made available, can be retrieved and then pre-processed. It's important also to say here there are like some now very neat and very easy, much more easy to use tools to operate with data, which is usually the climate data, which is now, like Paula mentioned before, like NetCDF. Like, so it's becoming, we're trying to articulate how to use this NetCDF data. And then there are some other libraries we went through, like in the description for the case study, which just basically help you to understand how to use this climate data to articulate and calculate for different areas, for could be small area or larger area, regional extent, the calculation of the component of the fire weather index. And then we give some example of how to visualize these indicators. As I mentioned, like there are like some free libraries, like and we made some example for R, like it's possible to show the commands, how we articulate the commands to calculate the component. This can be like some time series, daily time series, like we're showing here of the fire weather index, the most articulated index, and then to take some person specific points with specific coordinates, how to calculate the trends of the fire weather index, and how to write rasters into some JPEGs for a position of a map. It's important to see like as you move to different time frames, from historical to short term to seasonal forecasting, we can have different aims and objectives for the use of these indicators. Obviously, these are indicators that simplify reality, but this is one of the trade-off with like rapid assessment. We need to make some simplification just to straight through some aim from objectives. Otherwise, if we need to take more articulated models, usually they are either too much consuming or they can be too complex really to make some something that it's really handleable by like decision maker, more general decision maker. But having said so, there are like specific aims that for which they could be optimized, this index, this fire weather index. So we can move from like more operational service in short term to more tactical to like seasonal forecasts. So that just means you can have already control from fuel management plan to operationalize different unit and resources along the region and make them like making articulate a much more optimal control of the fuel in the forest. And then moving into climate projection into the future, we can move into like adaptation strategies for like control of forest resources. This is also a type indicator which is also established and consolidated, as we mentioned, in the EFIS service. And so it's just becoming common available. That's why we are really encouraging like to use and to acquaint, because there is a lot of community, large community. It's starting to interacting with the service. This is, for instance, the EFIS service is really giving some forecast in the short term, 7 to 10 days, but also some other information on related to forest fire. But also, aside from that, as I mentioned, it has been used, and we have implemented some operation of this tool, like for the calculation, also for strategy over the long term. Like this is the case for the Sardinia region, where the fire weather indicator was used for the regional strategy for climate change adaptation. There are several sectors which were like taken in considerations among these forests, which are a crucial sector and ecosystem among the ecosystems, and the information was characterized with daily climate data for different scenarios. So we have that's another important issue, to have some easy to implement the information and tool that you can connect with different scenarios, because often that's also something that we need to also very often re-elaborate. This is like how, according to new scenarios, we might need to change the projection, and it's a problem. But then aside from this, it's really feasible and for rapid assessment, and furthermore, it's important to consider other characteristics then at that point of the land system, like exposure given like the ecosystem, the forest present in the area.
Antonio, 30 seconds to conclude.
Just to conclude, it's something that we really think it's really easy and can aim at different sustainable development goals. So just not to spend much more time. And if you have any questions, please, I'll be happy to hear them, or you can send an email to any of us. Thank you,
Antonio. Thank you very much. So we are really at the closing time, because we are starting in 20 minutes the high-level panel this afternoon at 4:15. So unfortunately, we cannot answer all the questions. There were some questions really, all the questions were really interesting, some highly relevant for our work. For instance, the relevance of language barriers and different languages used by different disciplines. There were a lot of interesting questions. we're trying to address them separately. But let me just also to give to our audience some time to refresh before the high-level panel, because I guess that everyone is going to participate to the high-level panel. So let me thank the audience, and of course our presenter for the very nice, interesting, and engaging presentation. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.